You're 22 years old and you know what you've been told. That's the job. Not what's true, what you've been told. The distinction is the whole thing, and you're only now arriving at it on a Virginia road in April of 1865, carrying a sealed pouch for an army that stopped existing 11 days ago. You've been a Confederate dispatch rider for 14 months. You carry messages. You don't read them. You carry a sealed leather pouch from one command post to another. You hand it to whoever's waiting for it. You receive what they have to send back, and you ride. The system works because each link in the chain trusts the chain. The message gets where it's going. You don't know what the message says. You don't need to know. That rule held until 3 weeks ago. You weren't told it was breaking. You noticed it the way you notice a road that used to be one way and now is another. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulated evidence of too many wrong details until the wrongness becomes undeniable. You're carrying dispatches right now. You're riding a road in Virginia that you know from a year of riding it. The road is wrong. Not the road. The road is the road. What's wrong is everything on the road. The number of Union soldiers moving north instead of south, the specific absence of Confederate pickets at a position you've ridden through 40 times, the quality of the light, which doesn't explain anything, except that when you've been doing a thing long enough, you start to read its ambient conditions, and something about the quality of the light this morning is the quality of light in a place that has already happened, rather than a place where things are still happening. You keep riding. You have a dispatch in the pouch, and the dispatch has a seal on it, and the seal is still intact. And as long as the seal is intact, you are a courier performing your function. That's all you are. The courier performs his function. The courier doesn't read the message. The courier also doesn't know that Lee surrendered at Appomattox 11 days ago. The Confederate dispatch system in 1865 was a chain built for a war that was contracting faster than the chain could adjust. You'd understood this abstractly. Every soldier understood by April that the army was not what it had been. The attrition was visible in the personnel, the equipment, the quality of the horses, the specific way that officers who'd been confident in 1863 carried themselves in 1865, which was the way of men managing a problem rather than prosecuting a cause. You'd been writing dispatches since February of 1864. The first year was different. The system was tighter, more riders, more relay stations, more institutional heft behind each sealed message. You'd felt, in the first year, that what you were carrying mattered, not because you knew its content, but because the weight of the system behind it was palpable. Every relay station fully staffed, every route double covered, the pouch moving with the urgency of information that would change something when it arrived. 14 months later, the weight was different, lighter, in a way that wasn't good. Relay stations down to 1 or 2 men where there'd been 8, horses older and thinner, the pouches moving on schedule because the schedule was the one thing left that hadn't degraded. You'd noticed all of this the way you notice gradual change, not in a single observation, but in the accumulation of them, each individually explainable and collectively pointing somewhere you hadn't let yourself look directly. The rules of the courier were given to you at the beginning, and you'd held them without difficulty because they were the rules of a system that functioned, and a functioning system's rules make sense inside it. Rule 1. You carry the dispatch sealed. You do not break the seal. The chain's integrity depends on the message arriving in the condition it departed. A broken seal is evidence of tampering. You don't tamper. Rule 2. You ride the assigned route. The route is the route for reasons above your grade. Improvisation creates gaps. Gaps create vulnerability. You ride where you're sent. Rule 3. You deliver to the authorized recipient only. You confirm identity before transferring. A message in the wrong hands is worse than a message lost. Rule 4. You report what you observe on the road, not what you infer, not what you suspect, what you see in language. That describes rather than interprets. The interpretation is someone else's function. Rule 4 is the one that's breaking. Not because you're violating it, you're still reporting what you observe, because what you observe, reported accurately, produces a picture that the chain's interpretation function should be processing into a conclusion it is not reaching, or is reaching and not transmitting. You're not sure which. Either way, the chain is producing something that doesn't match the road. The relay station at Warwick was where the dispatches exchanged hands. You'd been through it 30 or 40 times. Major Dent ran it with the specific institutional precision of a man who believes in procedure independent of what the procedure produces. He was good at the job in the way that people are good at jobs that have stopped mattering while the person doing them hasn't received the notification. You handed him the pouch from the Western Relay at 7 a.m. on the 14th of April. He took it without looking at you. You gave him the route report, Union cavalry positions on the Lynchburg Road, number and direction, estimated speed of travel. You gave it in the language of observation, 30 riders, moving north-northeast, equipment consistent with a patrol in no tactical hurry. You didn't say, they're moving like men who have somewhere to be and nowhere to be defensive about because they've already won. That would be interpretation. The courier gives observation. The chain interprets. You gave the observation and waited for the chain to process it into something, and the chain processed it into ride the route. Dent wrote the route report down without reacting. He did this the way a man writes things down when he has decided that the writing is the last available form of normalcy and he is clinging to it. You asked when the return dispatch would be ready. He said it was ready now. He handed you a sealed pouch and a route, north to the Goochland station, then east to the Richmond Relay. You took the pouch, you looked at it. The seal was the Army of Northern Virginia's standard courier seal, wax intact. You said, "Sir, the Richmond Relay. Is the Richmond Relay still operational?" He looked at you for the first time since you'd arrived. Something specific happened in his eyes that you don't have a name for. It was the look of a man performing a calculation in real time about how much information the situation requires him to give. He said, "Ride the route." You said, "Yes, sir." You rode the route. The ticking clock was the road itself. 14 months of riding the same roads had given you a specific knowledge of their normal state, not the kind of knowledge you'd describe to someone else. Experiential knowledge, embodied in the way you held the reins and read the terrain, in the small calibrations the body makes in response to accumulated pattern. You knew how much traffic the Lynchburg Road normally carried at this time of day. You knew how Confederate pickets normally positioned at the crossings you used. You knew the particular quality of absence that meant a position had been abandoned versus a position that was simply between rotations. You knew the sounds the road made when it was carrying a war and the sounds it made when it wasn't. The war had sounds, the specific frequency of wagons moving with purpose, of horses under tactical pressure, of men whose movement had a destination they needed to reach before someone else reached it first. The war sounds had been with you for 14 months. You'd stopped hearing them the way you stop hearing the background noise of any place you live in long enough. The sounds were wrong this morning. Everything you knew was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of inaccurate, wrong in the sense of no longer applicable. The road was doing something different from what the road normally did, and the different thing it was doing was consistent. In every particular you could observe, with a road that existed in a different situation than the situation you'd been operating in. The Union soldiers you passed moved with the specific quality of men who had already won something and were now managing the aftermath. You knew what Confederate soldiers moving after a victory looked like. You knew what Confederate soldiers moving after a defeat looked like. You knew what Union soldiers moving aggressively looked like, the quality of their advance when they expected resistance. What these men looked like was none of those things. They looked like men going somewhere because they'd been told to go there, not because the going was urgent. They were carrying their rifles in the way you carry something you don't expect to need. You rode past two of these groups within 4 miles, and you noted them in the log you kept for the route report, and you kept riding. At the third Union position, an officer called to you, not an aggressive call, not a challenge. The call of a man who has seen something curious and is taking a moment to address it, because taking a moment is something he has time for. He said, "Where are you headed, friend?" You said, "North." He said, "You know the situation up there." You said, "I'm delivering dispatches." He looked at you in a specific way, not contemptuous, something more like the careful consideration of a man who is deciding how much to say to someone who doesn't yet know a thing that the man knows. He said, "You might want to check in with your command before you ride much further." You said, "Sir." You kept riding. That was the moment. Not when you'd noticed the road was wrong. This one, when a Union officer who had every reason to detain you as an enemy courier had instead let you go with the specific gentleness of a man delivering an indirect warning to someone who wasn't yet inside the information that the warning referred to. Men who've won a war Don't let enemy couriers ride through their positions without challenge unless they've decided the courier isn't a threat. The courier isn't a threat when the courier is carrying dispatches for an army that doesn't exist anymore. The Richmond Relay was a house at the edge of a town that still looked like a town, but had acquired the specific quality of a place in transition. Not destroyed. Transition is different from destruction. It was a place whose function was shifting in real time, where some things were the same as they'd always been, and other things were only present because nobody had told them to stop yet. The church was still a church, the store was still a store, the relay was still a relay, in the sense that Sergeant Wilkes was still at the table doing the relay's work, but the quality of the work had changed in a way that the presence of the work concealed. Sergeant Wilkes was at the relay. He'd been there every time you'd come through for 6 months. He was a man of 50 who ran logistics with the competence of someone who believed in the logistics independent of what the logistics were serving. He received your pouch. He gave you a return dispatch. He offered you water from a canteen that wasn't government issue. The canteen not being government issue was the kind of detail you noticed without processing, the way you noticed everything on the road, the way the body adds to the ledger even when the mind isn't keeping it consciously. You drank the water. You looked at him. You said, "Sergeant, I need to ask you something directly." He said, "Ask." You said, "What's in the pouch I'm carrying?" He said, "You know I can't tell you that." You said, "I know the rule. I'm asking anyway." He looked at you for a long time. The house was quiet. Outside, through the window, the town went about the business of its transition. He said, "What are you seeing on the road?" You said, "Union cavalry moving north without tactical urgency. Pickets absent at 3 positions I know are normally held. A Union officer who chose not to detain me." Wilkes was quiet. You said, "Lee surrendered." It wasn't a question. You'd arrived at it not through intelligence or calculation, but through the accumulated weight of a road that kept telling you something the dispatches weren't. You'd said it the way you say a thing when saying it is the only way to find out if the thing is true. Wilkes looked at his hands. They were resting on the table between you. He said, 5 days ago. You sat with that for a moment. Then you said, "And I'm carrying dispatches." He said, "The system hasn't stopped." You said, "Why hasn't it stopped?" He said, "Because stopping it means someone has to decide to stop it. And deciding to stop it means something. And some men aren't ready for what it means." You looked at the sealed pouch on the table between you. The Army of Northern Virginia's wax seal, intact, on a dispatch for an army that had surrendered 5 days ago. You said, "What am I carrying?" He said, "Operational orders, troop positioning, the machinery of the system still running because the machinery runs until someone turns it off." You said, "Men are receiving these orders and acting on them." He said, "Some." You said, "They don't know." He said, "Some don't." You sat with this for a long time. The road outside, the quality of the light, the Union officer who'd let you through with the careful gentleness of a man delivering an indirect warning. Men in the field receiving operational orders for an army that had been dissolved at Appomattox 5 days ago. Major Dent knew. That's what the calculation in his eyes had been at the Warwick Relay. Not whether to tell you. He'd already decided not to tell you before you arrived. The calculation was whether the situation required any deviation from the decision he'd already made. You'd asked about the Richmond Relay being operational, which was the question of someone who had noticed the road was wrong. He'd looked at you and done the math and decided that ride the route was still the answer. He knew, and he sent you out with a dispatch. You've spent the time since Wilkes told you working out what Dent was doing. Not in an accusatory sense. You've worked with Dent for 8 months, and you know him well enough to understand that he wasn't deceiving you for malicious reasons. He was doing something that has a different name, something that comes from a man who has been a functioning part of a system for so long that the functioning of the system has become its own justification. He was 52 years old and had been in logistics since before you were born. He'd run supply chains and dispatch networks and the institutional machinery of organized effort for 30 years before the war. First for a mercantile concern in Richmond, then for the railway, then for the army, and had spent the war running the same things at a larger scale with higher stakes. His entire professional identity was the function. The function ran well when he ran it. He was good at it in the way that people are good at things they've done for 30 years. The function had lost its purpose 5 days ago. Nobody had told him to stop running it. He hadn't been able to tell himself to stop running it. The running was the only thing he knew how to do in the situation, and the situation didn't give him anything else to reach for. The system runs until it stops. He kept the system running, not because he believed it was still serving its purpose. You don't think he believed that, or at least you don't think he'd examined it carefully enough to know whether he believed it. He kept it running because stopping it required a decision that was larger than he knew how to make. Stopping it meant acknowledging something. Running it meant not having to acknowledge it yet, and yet is a word that can cover a lot of distance. Men in the field were receiving dispatches from a command structure that had surrendered 5 days ago. They were acting on those dispatches. Some of them were probably dying on them. You sat with the pouch on the table between you and Wilkes for a long time. Wilkes told you something else before you left. He told you that he'd been sitting at the relay for 3 days knowing. He'd been receiving dispatches, logging them, sending them forward, the full institutional routine of a man performing his function. 3 days of this. He'd told two other riders what you'd just made him tell you. Both of them had continued riding, not because they were deceived, because stopping required a decision, and the decision was larger than the immediate situation seemed to allow for. You thought about that. Two other riders who knew, who kept riding. The system running on the momentum of men who understood the system had outlived its purpose and kept operating it anyway, not from deception and not from stupidity, but from the specific paralysis that comes when the alternative to the known thing is a void you don't have language for yet. You asked him what he was going to do. He said he didn't know yet. You asked him what you should do. He said that was the question, wasn't it? You looked at the dispatch on the table, the seal intact, the Army of Northern Virginia's wax pressed with a stamp that represented an army that had surrendered 5 days ago and whose commanding general was at this moment a paroled prisoner of war in a country he had just fought against. The seal was the whole thing. It had been the whole thing for 14 months. The seal meant, this message is what it says it is, from who it says it's from, traveling the chain it's supposed to travel. The seal meant the chain was intact. The chain was not intact, but the seal was still intact, and the seal was the only clear rule in a situation that had stopped having clear rules. You picked up the dispatch, you put it in your pouch, you rode the route. You rode it because the route was the route, and because what you did with what you now knew required a decision larger than a single morning, and because riding while you thought was available, and stopping while you thought was not. You've been making sense of this for the weeks since, and it still doesn't resolve into a clean answer. The road that afternoon was different from the road that morning. Not the terrain was the same, but you were different on it. You'd been a courier on the morning road, a functional component of a system, moving information from point to point without interpretation. On the afternoon road, you were a man who knew something, carrying something that existed in a state of fundamental contradiction. The dispatches in your pouch were real documents from a real command structure directing real operations. The command structure had surrendered. The operations were being conducted by men who did not know the command structure had surrendered. All of these things were simultaneously true, and the truth of all of them together was a thing that didn't have a category yet. You delivered the dispatch, you received the return, you handed it to Dent the next morning at Warwick, and he logged it, and you took the outbound pouch and rode the route again. You rode it for 3 more days after that, not because you were deceived, not because you hadn't processed what Wilkes told you, because Wilkes was right that stopping required a decision, and the decision was larger than a single moment on a road allowed for, because the seal was intact, and the seal's intactness was the only clear rule in a situation that had stopped having clear rules. Because some part of you understood, without being able to say it in language, that the thing you were riding through was not just a war ending but a world ending, and worlds don't end at the moment they end slowly, in the accumulated decisions of the people inside them to keep doing the things those people do until the doing finally stops. On the fourth day, Wilkes was gone from the Richmond relay. A man you didn't recognize was there instead, in civilian clothes, with no institutional affiliation visible. He said the relay was closed. He didn't give you an explanation. You rode back to Warwick with the undelivered dispatch in your pouch. Dent was gone. The station was empty except for a private who told you the major had ridden south 2 days ago and hadn't come back. You sat on your horse at the empty relay station for a long time. Then you rode home. Not north, not east. home, which was a direction the dispatches had never sent you in 14 months of riding, and which turned out to be the most straightforward navigation you'd done since you started. The sealed dispatches you carried between Appomattox and the day the station at Warwick went empty numbered 7. You've carried roughly 400 dispatches in 14 months. 7 of them were for an army that had already surrendered. You don't know what was in any of them. The rule held. You never broke a seal. The 7 dispatches moved through a system that was running on its own inertia, disconnected from the purpose that had built it. They were, in a literal sense, operational orders transmitted after operations had ceased. The men who received them, the ones who didn't yet know, acted on them. Some of those men are still out there, weeks later, in positions where the war is continuing, not because the war is continuing, but because nobody has reached them yet with the information that would change the calculation. General Wadi's men in the Indian Territory, scattered Confederate units in the far west that communication hasn't yet penetrated, men conducting a war that has been over for months, in the specific way that things that have ended continue when the ending information hasn't traveled far enough. You are not responsible for them. You've been over this in the specific way that you go over things you want to be sure about. You were a courier. You carried what you were given. You didn't know on the morning of the 14th, and when you knew, you'd already delivered the dispatch and you rode for 3 more days, not because you were committed to the deception, but because the alternative required something from you that the moment didn't prepare you for. What you are responsible for, or what you feel the weight of, is something more specific. You're responsible for the 3 days of riding after you knew. Those dispatches, the ones you carried with the full knowledge of what they were, those are yours in a different way than the dispatch on the 14th. You've tried to construct a framework in which those 3 days make sense. You've constructed several. None of them fully hold. The best one, the one that holds the longest, is the one Wilkes offered without knowing he was offering it. The system runs until it stops. You were inside the system. Systems don't stop because one component decides to stop. They stop when the stopping propagates through enough components that the system can't continue. You were one component. You stopped eventually. The system stopped eventually. The interval between your stopping and the system's stopping was not nothing, but it was also not your sole creation. The worst version is simpler. You knew and you kept writing because writing was easier than not writing, and the seal on the dispatches gave you a rule to follow in a situation that had lost its rules, and following the rule was the path of least resistance through a thing you didn't know how to face. Both of those things are probably true. The truth of both of them simultaneously is the thing you're going to carry for however long you carry things. The 7 dispatches I carried after Appomattox, the sealed pouch I left on the step of the empty relay at Warwick, the specific quality of the Union officer who let me ride through because he decided I wasn't a threat. What you were carrying in the last 7 was the institutional momentum of a system that had outlived its purpose by the specific number of days required for the people managing it to accept that the purpose was gone. Some of them managed it in days. Some of them managed it in weeks. General Stan Wadi in the Indian Territory managed it in 2.5 months. The road told you. The road was telling you before Wilkes told you in language. You kept writing. The seal was intact. The seal is always intact until someone breaks it. The message inside is whatever the message is. The courier's job is to carry it, not to decide whether it should be carried. The courier's job ends when the system ends. The system ended. You were still inside it when it ended. The seal on the last dispatch you carried was still intact when you left it on the step of the empty building at Warwick. Some messages arrive after the meaning has already left them. The seal holds either way.